stocks are going down. The New York Times Index, and this isn't the Dow Jones Index, the New York Times Index covered all stocks on the stock market. And what we see in the 1920s is that the value of stocks are increasing in a dramatic fashion. I'm going to start you guys in 1924, and the index number of the New York Times New York Times Index at that time was 110. Of course, I can't tell you what 110 means. I'm just telling you it's a number, and all we're looking for are behaviors in the aftermath of that moment. So what we see is that between 1924 and 1929, the stock market, the average value of stocks on the stock market goes up in a dramatic fashion. So much so that by the time we get to 1929, the New York Times Index, which had been at 110, was now at 440. So what that means is that the average value of all stocks on the stock market was increasing by 4 times. Pretty impressive. So that if you were a conservative investor like me and you had $10 here, then you're going to have $40 there. How exciting is that, right? But of course, most investors are much less conservative than I am, and they would have $1,000 here or $4,000 here, $10,000 here, $40,000 there, $1 million here, and $4 million there. The value of stocks were increasing in a dramatic fashion, and it would have, of course, a significant impact on the American economy. Now the question becomes, of course, why were the stock values increasing in such dramatic fashion? And we all have to understand that the stock market, every single day, exists in its own kind of little weird world, right? And we've been in a period of incredible volatility of the stock market. On news on the pandemic, dropping, and then a little bit of good news going up. And we're talking about 1,600 point swings of the Dow Jones, just these monumental movements in the average value. And all of that's based upon, of course, those who are buying and selling stocks and their feelings and their emotions and the psychology of their understanding of what's happening here. So the stock market does kind of function in its own world. I have to tell you that here's these things that I'm kind of naive about. I used to think that if the value of a stock went up, that meant that the value of the company was performing well, and the value of the stock would reflect that, of course. And that could be the case, right? But there are companies that are underperforming and their values go up, and there are companies that are performing very well and their values go down, because it's all about these investors and their emotional connections to what's happening, and how their behaviors that become so kind of critical. So we always want to look at, okay, within the stock market, what is happening here? What are the foundations for the bull market that will lead us ultimately to the great crash? And here they are for you guys. So number one, I want to suggest to you that a factor leading to the great crash, a factor of the bull market is the way we should be saying it, was the maldistribution of wealth. Now what this means, of course, is that there were people with a lot of disposable income, wealthy people with a lot of disposable income. And that meant, what are they going to do with their money? And the thing that they thought to do with their money, of course, was put in the stock market. And of course, the more they invest in the stock market, the more that was a component of the buoyancy of the stock market, causing it to raise in its own way. So, this very thing that I suggested to you is somewhat problematic about the general economy became part of the component, a component part of the bull market that was taking place. Another thing that really influenced the rise of values in the stock market were low interest rates. On orders from the presidents of the United States, the Federal Reserve, which controls interest rates, kept the interest rate very, very low, even though it was a time of relative prosperity. At least that was the perspective. And the idea was just to make money easy for whoever would want to have that money. So they lowered the interest rate so low that you could actually borrow money and invest money and make money. Generally, that is not the way it's supposed to go, right? I mean, you would never really want to take a cash advance off of your credit card to buy stocks, because routinely the price of the interest rate on your credit card is going to be more than whatever you're going to gain on your stocks. There's very few cases where you are able to borrow money. It's really not the way you're supposed to play it. Borrow money to invest money, of course, and make money. But you could do that in the 1920s. And that seems fun. I mean, it's like gambling with other people's money. I hate gambling with my money, but I'd love to gamble with your money. You guys, set me up here, and I'll go to Vegas, and I'll do all the crazy stuff. Okay. Anyway, low interest rates becomes another kind of force in promoting the bull market. Something else that was going on, and it's just kind of like, it shows you the sort of wild times in the stock market. They had something called margin buying. So let me just tell you a little bit about margin buying. Margin buying meant that you could purchase stocks without paying the total of the amount of the purchase price. And indeed, one of the things that becomes so remarkable about this is that you had to just put down a little bit, just on the margin, okay? So the rule at that time would have been that you could buy stock, but only put down 10%. and yet still you could simply allow the stock to function on the stock market. So, let's try to go back to the board just a little bit here. So let's just say we're going to do this. We're going to do the margin buying. We're going to buy $100 worth of stock back here in 1924. Now, because we have to put 10% down, we have to give them $10. So we actually have a $10 investment that becomes part of this arrangement. But of course, the rest of it is just sort of loaned to us, the 90% that we're not putting down. Now we invest in $100 worth of stock. That's the easiest way to do it, just a total dollar value, and we just let it ride. And we let it ride until 1929, and all of a sudden that $100 worth of stock is now worth $400. Now let's just say at that moment we want to sell our stock. We're going to take advantage of the profits that we've made. So of course you had to pay your balance. You owe $90, and of course $10 was your initial investment. But still, the return on that investment is $300. You put $10 down, and you're walking away with $300. And of course, this is me, using a really conservative example. Some others, of course, were doing, 10% down on $10,000 or 10% down on $4 million, and of course, letting it ride, and with the potential of reaping massive profits off of their marginal investments. Now, here's the problem. There are 2 times when you have to pay the margin. So that's the amount that you owe. You put 10% down, but you owe 90%. You have to pay it when you sell, of course. So those who are lending the money, they want that money back. But you also have to pay that margin when the values of the stocks turn down. It was just a little bit of a protective device for those that are loaning money. The second that the stock values go down, there's what they call the margin call. They call on the margin. They want their money back. And the problem was, when that happens in 1929, is these guys didn't have the 90%. There's no foundation for all of this money that they had basically borrowed. They only had the 10%. And so when the margin calls go out, of course, no one has the ability to repay them, and it becomes a real force, kind of dragging the markets down in a fairly serious way. A final thing that was functioning, and again, it kind of shows you this bizarre gamesmanship of the entrepreneurial situation of the stock market, was this thing called blue sky corporations. And the blue sky corporations were simply paper stocks. There was no real company there. It was just a stock that was put up on the board. And I'll tell you the story as best I can understand it. So let's just say that I want to create a company. They use this fictitious name, but in this case it's real fictitious company. It's going to be called the Chris Johnson Company. Now, there's no real company, but I'm going to I don't know yet to do that. I'm going to print out some shares of stock, and I'm going to go down and get my company up on the board there in the New York Stock Exchange. In those days, it actually was like just a regular blackboard. And so, they would put the Chris Johnson Company up on the board, and it would have initial purchase price of like 5 cents a share or something like that. So just sitting up there, and of course, I just put my name up there, and they're willing to put the name up there too. So someone's walking in, of course, they're checking it out, and they're looking for deals, they're looking for bargains, and they see Chris Johnson Company up there, 5 cents, and they go, I don't know what that's all about, but what the heck, buy me 100 shares of Chris Johnson. I mean, it's not that much money, of course, and so that guy's going to buy some shares of Chris Johnson, and then someone else is going to buy some shares, and pretty soon the stock value is increasing because they're buying it. And it starts at 5%, pretty soon it's 25%, then it's $1 a share, then it's $5 a share, and even up from there, okay? And so, these kind of stocks were on the stock market. They're just sitting there. And the big problem was, it's kind of the caveat emptor. The buyers didn't know what they were buying. They just see a company called the Chris Johnson Company, which seems to be, of course, increasing in relative value. But here's the thing. Whenever you have a downturn in the stock market, it's called a correction. And the correction concept is that stocks should go to true value. So instead of the inflated value where they were, they should go to true value. And I'm sure you guys can guess that the true value of Blue Sky Corporation was 0. There's nothing there. They're just blue sky, okay? And so these Blue Sky Corporations became another powerful drag, bringing down the stock market as soon as the crash comes. Now, this is this buoyant bull market all through the 1920s, and existing pretty much because of all the factors I told you about, but also this faith in the investors. They kept saying the value's going up and up and up, and it led to more investments, of course, and thinking that this is going to continue on forever. Now, it was a classic bubble. It's a bubble, And what happens every single time, and you never want to be at the end of that bubble. There was the bubble in the housing market in around 2008. I remember my neighbors, their homes, they're putting their homes up for sale at like $600,000, and I thought, no way in the world, is my home or your home worth anything like that? And it wasn't really, okay? It was just this bubble that was taking place, and the tragedy, of course, is when bubbles burst, they're going to do a lot of damage. But in late October, October 29th is one of the days that becomes part of this. There's a Thursday and a Tuesday that come into play. Sorry that I don't have them exactly in my head. It's just been one of those things I've never thought was absolutely necessary to know. We don't know what happened. Bubbles just burst. That's what happens, right? You blow up, even if you have your little balloon, you blow it up, you're going to burst if you keep blowing it, right? Your bubble of your bubble gum is going to burst at some time. And it could have been internal, machinations. It could have been insider trading. It could have been people who just thought, it's about time and we better do something about that. But all of a sudden, the stock market begins to descend in a fairly precipitous way. And there's little jukes and jives on its way down, but it begins a cascade. And by the time we get to 1933, the New York Times Index is at half. It's like at 56. I didn't do a very good job of getting this for you guys. And I'm guessing you can't see that anyway. But we started out at 110, we went to a high of 440, and then down to 56. The stocks are half the value they had been at the time we get to 1924. So the stock market crashes in a monumental way. Now, one of the things that you should say when you hear about this is, so what? There have been extraordinary, moments of volatility in the stock market. I remember in 1983, I think it was, the stock market crashed massively in one day. And I remember coming home from, reading about that or listening on the news. I'm going, oh, what does this mean? And it didn't really mean anything. It just meant that there was some crazy volatility within the structures of the stock market at that time. So it's legitimate to say, okay, the stock market crashed. Well, so what? Well, this is kind of the so what part of it, okay? So it didn't impact all Americans, but it impacted like the richest 10%. And it's interesting to me that, they talk about trickle-down theory. So the rich people trickle the wealth down to the rest of us, and there's a dubious kind of quality to that notion. But trickle-down misery, I mean, when the rich people get hit hard, it's probably going to impact the rest of us in a fairly pronounced kind of way. So although only about 10% of the American people owned stocks at that time, that was the richest 10%. And when they were impacted negatively, that will have a larger kind of negative impact. But we believe that the critical factor, this is sort of like the significance of the Great Crash, is that it created what you might call a psychology of depression. So this simply means, how do the Americans feel about the economy in the aftermath of the Great Crash? It's kind of like a little bipolar situation. So prior to the Great Crash, everyone's like, oh, wow, it's great, the economy's great, the stock market's great, it's wonderful, okay? So they're kind of riding this high and euphoria of this amazing economic period. But then the crash happens, and then the stock market begins to slide. And all of those that had been so euphoric in terms of the wonderful dynamic of the economy began to be the naysayers. Oh my God, everything seems to be really horrible right now. This is a bad thing. So, it's interesting. This is simply it's based upon the feelings of the people, right? And we measure this in consumer confidence. And when consumer confidence is high, the economy tends to be going up, right, doing well. And when consumer confidence is low, the economy tends to go down. And we just think that in the aftermath of the Great Depression or the Great Crash, everyone began to think, oh man, things are bad. And of course, if they start to think things are bad, then things might actually begin to be bad. But there's actually one last thing I have to tell you about. There are some people who say that the Great Crash was not enough really to cause the Great Depression. There's got to be something else happening here. Even though it might kind of expose the real ills of the American economy at that time. But here's this last critical factor, and for the economists, the monetarists, this is the only thing you even want to talk about, right? And it's often known as the monetary crunch, And this has to do with the behavior of the Federal Reserve, and the behavior of the Federal Reserve ultimately becomes catastrophic in terms of the American economy at that moment. So let me just tell you about the Great Crunch. We have to at least give the Federal Reserve the fact that it was relatively new. It was not terribly experienced. So in 1929, you can say it was born in 1913, 1929. We're looking at about, I can't do my math quickly enough, 16 years old, right? It's not terribly old at that time. Not a lot of experience, of course, no significant experience with any kind of real economic problem, and yet all of a sudden, of course, this is thrown in their laps. Now, here's what happened. I told you that during the 20s, the Fed, on orders of the president, had left interest rates at a very low level. And so they're cruising along at this low level. But then all of a sudden, of course, here comes the great crash. And the Fed basically panicked, and they're going, oh my God, we did the wrong thing. We've been doing the wrong thing. Now, if the wrong thing is low interest rates, of course, the right thing is high interest rates. So in the face of the crash, in the face of a falling economy, the Fed begins to crank up the interest rate. And it's not just that they cranked up the interest rate, but they also began to cut the money supply. So they're doing two things that make it harder for people to get money. And the image is, that the economy is like going over the waterfall or over the cliff. The waterfall is going to work for me a little bit better, okay? Now, when you're going over the waterfall, what you're looking for, of course, are lifelines. And lifelines that can pull you from going over the waterfall economically are things like low interest rate loans and easy money. If the money is there, and that's generally the way that the Fed perceives it, right? When the economy is going down, you lower the interest rates to guarantee that people can get loans to continue their businesses, to continue their farms, to continue to buy their houses and stuff like that. But the Fed did the exact opposite thing here. They raised interest rates, contracted the money supply in a significant way. And so instead of throwing the lifeline to the people going over the waterfall, they're pulling it away. They're making it harder for them to grasp. And of course, the end result is that the economy begins to go into free fall. The behaviors of the Federal Reserve at this time. And by the way, massive lesson learned, right? For the future, the Fed will realize it has to really be attentive to, of course, these economic downturns and careful with the movements, the dialing up and down of the interest rate. But what happens that becomes sort of this powerful outcome associated with the Great Crash and the monetary crunch is that the economy will fall to what we call the nadir period. And the nadir, this is a word I've used before in the Black Nadir, this means the lowest point, right? So that means that the economy is falling to the lowest point where, just over the cliff, and where we very much begin to settle into a catastrophic situation that becomes known to us as the Great Depression. And I'm going to tell you guys about the nadir period as soon as I get things set up just a little bit, and I'll be right back.